At the same time, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for a cessation of hostilities. Addressing the UN Security Council this afternoon, he lamented the escalation of hostilities after Iran launched missiles on Israel.
UNIFIL peacekeepers remain in position, and the UN flag continues to fly despite Israel's request to relocate. I reiterate our deep appreciation to the military and civilian members of our UN peacekeeping force, UNIFIL, and to troop contributing countries. The safety and security of all UN personnel must be ensured. Madam President, civilians are paying a terrible price, which I utterly condemn. Since last October, more than 1,700 people have been killed in Lebanon, including over 100 children and 194 women. Over 346,000 people are confirmed to have been displaced from their homes, and government estimates put this number as high as 1 million. Another 128,000 people, both Syrian and Lebanese, have crossed into Syria. The UN has mobilized all its capacities to provide urgent humanitarian aid in Lebanon, and I ask the international community to fully fund our appeal. Since October 8th, Hezbollah attacks on Israel have killed 49 people, with over 60,000 people displaced from their homes. It is absolutely essential to avoid an all-out war in Lebanon, which would have profound and devastating consequences. Madam President, yesterday Iran launched approximately 200 ballistic missiles towards Israel. It stated it was in response to the killings of Hassan Nasrallah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Commander Abbas Nilforushan last week, as well as that of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in July. Millions of people across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory were forced to seek shelter. One person was killed from the Iranian strikes, a Palestinian in the occupied West Bank. As I did in relation to the Iranian attack in April, and as should have been obvious yesterday, in the context of the condemnation I expressed, I again strongly condemn yesterday's massive missile attack by Iran on Israel. And these attacks, paradoxically, do nothing to support the cause of the Palestinian people or reduce their suffering. Almost 1 year has passed since the atrocious 7 October acts of terror by Hamas and the taking of hostages. And since last October, Israel has conducted in Gaza the most deadly and destructive military campaign in my years as Secretary General. The suffering endured by the Palestinian people in Gaza is beyond imagination. At the same time, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to deteriorate with Israeli military operations, construction of settlements, evictions, land grabs, and intensification of settler attacks, progressively undermining any possibility of a two-state solution. And simultaneously, armed Palestinian groups have also used violence. Hamas has continued to launch rockets, and just yesterday, 7 Israelis were killed in a terror attack in Jaffa. Madam President, the events of the past week, the past months, and indeed nearly the past year make it clear. It's high time for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, with the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, the effective delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza, and irreversible progress to a two-state solution.
All right, that is the UN Secretary General there, Antonio Guterres, and also what he's had to say is that the deadly cycle of tit-for-tat violence must stop, and saying that time is running out. And this, of course, was taking place as the UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting today following what is taking place, of course, in Israel at the moment. And if we are able to bring up those pictures of that meeting that is currently taking place there in the UN Security Council, the Russian Federation is speaking right now. Of course, we will then be bringing you some of what is being said there, the remarks by Israel, Lebanon, Iran, and of course already we've heard even from the United States, Slovenia, Algeria, and these are some of the countries that of course have expressed concern about what is taking place currently in the Middle East, and sharing some of the sentiments there as the UN Secretary General. And we are now in conversation with SABC News International editor Sophie Mokoena. And Sophie, of course, as we are watching these developments in the Security Council, a lot of people, of course, wondering right now if these particular, words essentially that are being shared there, a number of statements we're hearing, of course, about a concern of an escalation of the situation on the ground. But a number of people are asking what happens next.
Well, indeed, you are quite correct. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, earlier on pointed out that this is something that has never happened during his tenure. That speaks to the gravitas and the impact of this conflict at this moment. And therefore, many countries are calling for ceasefire. Many countries are trying to persuade all the countries that are affected. You're talking about Palestine, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iran. These are some of the countries that are involved in this standoff as we speak, to perhaps pull back. But it looks like it's not happening, because as you saw earlier on today, we saw Israel embarking on the ground operation. Unfortunately, in the southern part of Lebanon, there was that ambush, and 7, we are told, IDF members or the Israel soldiers were killed. And you'll continuously see these casualties, but don't lose sight of what's happening in Gaza. In Gaza, people are continuing to die in Gaza. And you also have other areas where you have people dying. We saw just now, a few minutes ago, in Syria, the bombardment of Syria. And you will definitely have civilians as casualties. But it looks like the powerful nations, I'm talking about the United States of America, who can be able to manage this situation in relation to the relationship with Israel, looking very paralyzed. And you have Russia that can assist in relation to Iran. And on that side, clearly Russia will not move in terms of persuading Iran to pull back, because no one is able to convince Israel to pull back. And therefore, this conflict is just escalating.
And, especially because earlier on we heard from the UN Secretary General expressing concern, as you say, about the civilians that he says are being caught in the crossfire, and there now needs to be a much more urgent move towards making sure that an all-out war is avoided. But at the same time, this is a UN Secretary General who's condemned the attack yesterday, saying that, really it makes things difficult. But he himself has now been declared persona non grata when it comes to Israel. What are the implications?
Well, it simply means that he can't travel to Israel. If there were to be meetings or important engagements that are supposed to happen in Israel, it will be a problem. But also the checkpoints where you have Israel mending those checkpoints in the Middle East, it will be difficult for Antonio Guterres to access those areas. And therefore, this is quite disturbing, because this is the chief of the United Nations. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, the main objective was to ensure that there's peace around the world. The Security Council with that responsibility. And we know that this happened because of the Second World War, where Jews were targeted. Now, it is quite surprising that Israel will decide to silence or to stop the UN boss or chief doing his work, because he has to travel to these member countries. And therefore, I think we expect member countries to issue statements in relation to what Israel has done in terms of banning the Secretary General. It will be difficult for him to travel to the Middle East or to intervene if there was a need. And you also have the peacekeeping troops in the Middle East. He has to move around in the Middle East, and therefore his life is now in danger. When you ban someone, you are creating enemies for that person. And I think this is something that the UN member countries must attend to, particularly United States of America, because US is able to speak to Israel. The same with Russia. Russia is able to speak to Iran and many other countries. The developed North must, those who are supporting Israel must engage Israel. The developing South, with good relations with Iran, they must do the same. And we saw earlier on, as you pointed out, the current debate that France and the other countries, including the United Kingdom, are saying that they are not going to join that conflict in the Middle East, which is a sign that there are countries that are sober in terms of what must happen. They are all calling for cessation of hostilities on all sides.
And quite a significant time, because Israel's ambassador, for example, to the United Nations earlier saying that Israel will retaliate, and also Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier on X saying, and I quote, "It will be a year of total victory. Happy New Year to the people of Israel." What else do we know about the latest on the ground?
It's not a Happy New Year for the 7 soldiers who were killed today, their families, because these are people with families. And therefore, I think we will see another challenge should Israel retaliate. Because when you look at what transpired yesterday, Iran was targeting specific targeted points like your military base and also the facilities of the intelligence services of the Israel, not the civilians. And therefore, I think Israel, when they retaliate, will they be able to avoid loss of lives in terms of civilians and target only installations or facilities that are responsible for the conflict or that they are fighting? We don't know.
Of course, Sophie, as you say there, as to how will it all unfold, because we heard from the ambassador earlier on who said that they will do everything within the confines of the law. But let's see then what happens. Thank you so much for that update. And remember, of course, the Security Council meeting is still continuing. It's an emergency one that has been called there just a day after we saw those airstrikes there being launched by Iran into Israel earlier on. And of course, if we do still have those live pictures there, we are going to be bringing you Israel, we're going to be bringing you Lebanon and Iran as well, who are also expected to speak at the UN Security Council. And of course, the UN Secretary General expressing concern after, this particular attack, and also condemning the attack yesterday, and also speaking about the situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and saying that this situation continues to deteriorate, and also saying that the events of the past week, the past months and the past year make it clear that it's high time for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And that is, of course, the UN Security Council there, as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was in fact addressing. So we will be taking you to the UN Security Council meeting as soon as we hear from Israel, we hear from Lebanon, and we also hear from Iran.